Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. As we come this morning, I can't help but think of mountaintops, and I have been on my fair share of mountaintops. Part of that is because my mom is a coal miner's daughter. When I was growing up, my mom, my grandma, my great-grandma, and I would frequently drive from Ohio, where we lived, to West Virginia, where the family was. We'd do this at least 3 times a year. My favorite part of the trip, though, would typically come after dinner on our first full day there, because it was then that I could convince my great-uncle to load my mom, my grandma, and I into the 4x4 pickup truck and take us up the side of the mountain. The way up to the top was a dried-up creek bed. It had a lot of dirt and rocks, and of course it had its share of fallen trees as well. The mountains of Appalachia are the oldest in the country and weathered more than the other mountain ranges, and there are just trees that are coming from everywhere. The vines are just densely packed. So all the way up the side of the mountain, you're just thrown back and forth as you dodge the boulders and the fallen trees. It always gets a little more fun if there's a little mud to slip in as well. But eventually you would get to the top. And at the top of that mountain, we would get out and we would stand in awe. We could see what felt like forever on the top of the mountain. And then there was mountain after mountain, and there were more trees than I thought anyone could ever conceivably count. The only way that you could tell which way was which was to try to find one of the high voltage power lines and follow it across as it cut through the mountains. And on that mountaintop, everything seemed small and insignificant, including myself. Who was I in the vastness of this? How could any one tree or any one person matter in the great scheme of things? Being the young philosopher that I was, I always wanted to stay on that mountain a little longer. I wanted to stay a little longer, of course, than the rest of my family. I wanted just a few more minutes to be lost in my thoughts, to take it all in. I imagine that's what happened to Peter. He was on the mountaintop with James, John, and Jesus. But Peter's mountaintop experience, it was there that Jesus was transfigured. His appearance, it changed. He became dazzling white. A professor of mine says that Jesus would have lit up like the Vegas Strip. And not only that, but then Moses and Elijah appeared and began to talk with Jesus. When Peter saw this, he said, "It's good for us to be here. Let's make a place to camp out and be here for a while." Peter was excited. Moses and Elijah were ones that the Bible said were going to be the signs that the Messiah had come. The one that they had been waiting for is really here. This Jesus is really the Messiah. And under these circumstances, who wouldn't want to stay there a little while? The disciples were tired. They had been following Jesus for some time, and as Jesus traveled through the countryside, healing sick people, calming storms, feeding thousands of people, these disciples were there too, working day and night, following Jesus, learning and trying to do what Jesus asked of them. And finally, they get a chance to glimpse Jesus in all his glory. So they wanted it to last. They wanted to stay there. And while they were there, taking in this wondrous scene, then the voice of the Father comes. "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." What a command. listen to the Son of God. If they hadn't been paying full attention by now, they certainly would have snapped to attention when that voice came. The Father spoke, giving authority to the Son, the one they'd followed. And on the mountaintop, it was easy for Peter, James, and John to see Jesus, to know who he really is. And they didn't want to leave that. And it's this way for us in our lives as well. When through the darkness that fills so much of life, we have these mountaintop experiences where things seem clear, we want to stay. Because it's there that we get to step out of ourselves and we get to gain some perspective. It's there that we get to know who we are. And then all of a sudden, just click and clarity comes. It would be nice to stay in that state. But for Peter, James, and John, and Jesus, they had to come down just like we do. The next day when Jesus had come down from the mountain, he heard the cries of a father begging for his son to be freed from a demon. Kind of like after my family had come down from that mountaintop that night. The next day we went to my great-uncle's house. He was still suffering the effects of a massive stroke from years before. He could understand what we said, but only one word would come out of his mouth as he tried to speak. And in terrible frustration, he would eventually throw up his hands when the confusion filled our faces again. So the disciples, my family and your family, we can have these mountaintop experiences, but they don't last. They come to an abrupt end more times than not. And sooner or later, you're going to be sitting by that bed of a loved one asking, Jesus, where are you? Jesus, can you come and heal? Today we see that undoubtedly Jesus is the Son of God, and he's glorified on that mountain. But we know that he comes down from the mountain, and he sets his face toward Jerusalem. Right after transfiguration, Jesus takes the disciples away from the visions, away from that mountaintop, back down to those who need him the most. Jesus takes them to a man whose son is possessed by a demon. Jesus leads them down the mountain to the hurting, the unbelieving, and the desperate ones in the valley below. And just like the disciples, we get to get a glimpse of Jesus' true glory right before we see him turn his face to go to Jerusalem, which will ultimately lead to the cross. Much more of our lives seems to be lived not on the mountain, but in the valley. And the only way that we can walk through that valley is to know that Jesus is there too. The same one who was glorified on the mountain is the same one who is crucified on a cross. Peter, the one who wants to dwell on the mountain with Jesus, he's also the one that's going to deny Jesus 3 times as he hangs. But even when Peter denies, Jesus is still there. You see, Jesus comes down from that panoramic view of the mountaintop into those intricate parts of all of our lives. He comes down to heal the sick, to comfort the sorrowful, to find the lost. He comes down to you, and he says that he is always with you. And as Jesus came down from the mountain to be with the world below, he also calls us, his followers, his body, his church. He calls us to follow. He calls us to bear witness to his work in this world. He calls us to walk through the deepest valleys in his name by the power of the Spirit, and we are called to transform them. We are called to speak his name in the darkest valley. And so as we transition from this season of mountaintop epiphanies to transfiguration to the Lenten road to Jerusalem and the cross, I pray that this glimpse of Jesus on the mountain will sustain you through the Mount of Olives and the betrayal, through Jerusalem, through the cries of crucifixion, through Golgotha and the cross, until we finally gather on that Easter morning to see him and give thanks to God. Amen.